Welcome back to the Good Growth Podcast, brought to you by BGF, the UK and Ireland's most active equity investor. Today we're joined by Ross Linnett, founder of ReciteMe, a pioneering software business on a mission to make websites more accessible. In this episode, Ross shares how his own experience with dyslexia led him to found the business, what it really takes to scale internationally, particularly in the US, and his view on the dangers of growing too fast. Let's dive in.
Ross, welcome to the BGF Good Growth Podcast.
Jimmy, thank you very much.
Where did the name Recite Me come from?
It was one of those, this is a non-story by the way, but it was one of those where we just went through name after name after name after name and couldn't decide. And then we says, we'll go away and we will just all like sleep on it. And it was the name that everybody come back with as the favourite. And I think a lot of times you put too much logic sometimes into a name. And you just got to go with which feels right.
Yeah.
You know?
So can you remember the other names that were on the list now?
Some of them were crazy, just, it was, bearing in mind it was related to accessibility. So it's like...
So explain to us what the company does.
So what Recite is, it's an accessibility company. We were one of the first to create the technology where we took typical technology that would sit on a computer that would help somebody with dyslexia, visual impairments, like reading the text out aloud or changing the background colors or giving dictionary definitions of words. But we allowed that technology to integrate into websites. So websites can speak to you if you go onto a website like Coca-Cola, but it's the website's doing it with its own technology.
Okay.
It's not doing it with the computer's technology, and we're the technology provider behind that.
And where did the idea come from? What was the origin story of it?
So the background is, I was dyslexic, but I didn't realize I was dyslexic till I was in the student union. So technically after university, and I was doing a presentation and somebody pointed out and said, my father specializes in dyslexia. I think you should get yourself tested. So got myself tested. I think they stopped on the fourth test and said, Ross, we don't need to do the last test. You're definitely dyslexic. And when I got the software, my life completely changed. I didn't read. I've probably read 5 books in my lifetime. The internet, I'd maybe read a news story and it just, you know what it's like as a dyslexic.
Yeah.
You can read, but it's just not fun.
Yeah.
But when we got the software that would, read or speak text to me, or change the background color, so I read a little bit faster if I have blue text and a yellow background, it completely changed my life.
Yeah.
It absolutely changed my life. All of a sudden, the world was accessible to me. But then I went to another computer and I was back to square one because the software was installed on the computer.
Right.
And then I went to the library, and because the library had no admin access and you couldn't install any software, every single one of those computers was inaccessible to me, being dyslexic. And that didn't work for me. But roughly at the same time, we were involved as a student movement with the Disability Discrimination Act. And it was very clear that organizations had to make at source their organization as accessible to people with disabilities as possible. Now, there was a very clear plan for people who, for physical disabilities of just installing ramps and getting people into restaurants and the likes of that. But there was no plan on how do you make online content accessible at the organizational level. Because me, as a dyslexic, buying software for £200 and installing it is not making your content accessible online.
Yes.
So that's where we created the concept of Recite that took a lot of the functions that would be loaded onto the computer, such as reading text aloud, changing background colors, dictionary definitions of words, magnification. And we allowed that to be installed onto a website.
Yeah.
So if you go to websites like coca-cola.com and click on the accessibility logo, you will get a suite of tools that will then make that website more inclusive for somebody like myself and yourself who's dyslexic.
Completely. No, it makes an amazing difference when you can listen to things rather than read. And writing, I struggle with as well, which is why.
Yeah,
form of podcast. So it's definitely my medium to it. There's a very funny aside about that. When that was happening, David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party, and because he's got a disabled son, he put his most promising shadow minister into the young shadow minister in, which was Jeremy Hunt. So he sort of really ended up shadowing the bill in opposition disorders. But then Hunt is partly, that's why I took a lot of interest in it when he was health secretary, because of his background in it. Anyway, that's
because I did do a trade mission with David Cameron. This is me bragging here.
Yeah.
But Jeremy Hunt was on it as well.
What was that trade mission like, right? Was that one of the ones to China?
Yes. So when our relations with China started improving, they sent George Osborne, and they took 10 to 15 tech firms with them, because technology was obviously going to be one of the big things, the big sectors in China. And basically we just went and interacted, and I think I've done my best to chat with all the Chinese firms, pitch what we did. It got a lot of traction. You'd be surprised that China is very, quite forward with regards to disability software and the likes of that. And we were lucky enough to ask to go back in the main trade mission.
Yeah.
And it was strange, because I don't think I'll ever get to this point in my life, but you never know. But we had a 747 that was privately chartered just for us, and it was Virgin, and it was just the strange thing. It was like, that's our private aircraft, and it's a 747.
And how you've also, so give us a size and scale of the company now, where you are today.
We've roughly got about 100 staff.
Yeah.
We've got roughly about 25 in America. We've got 4 or 5 in Australia, and the rest is in the UK.
Yeah.
With the vast majority of them in the northeast of England. Gateshead.
And what have you found about kind of expanding to America? Because it is a theme that kind of runs through your whole journey, right?
Yeah.
Of like China, you just talk about there, but also Australia and America. How have you found it kind of expanding in the US?
The first thing I'd say about that is, as a country, we need to be ambitious. And if you're doing anything with software, you can go vertical very quickly across multiple continents. And one of the differences I do see between, and this is Europe, not just the UK and the US, is that they have a culture of let's go for it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you miss big, but sometimes you hit big. And that's why the vast majority of the tech firms are US based at the moment.
Yeah.
Hopefully that will change, and we might get a multi-billion pound up to £1 trillion UK company. But, it has been challenging. The US is doing very well. It accounts for roughly about 25% of our revenue, and it is actually growing faster than the UK.
Okay.
There is big difference. There's big cultural differences. I used to live in California about 20 years ago, and I think the saying is, the US is the graveyard for British businesses. And after living there and having the business there for 3 years, the biggest reason I think is that culturally we feel like we know the US. We watch the films, they speak the same language. There is a lot of cultural similarities, but in business, it's quite different. One of the ones I touched on earlier is that they are real go-getters. They will take risks.
Yeah.
That I don't think any country in the world would. But also there's elements that are polar opposites. So if we have somebody in the UK that's trying to give us the hard sell, we will automatically, as a culture, switch off. And this isn't just the UK, so I'm not going to bash the UK.
Yeah.
This is Australia, this is Europe, this is France, this is Germany. We just don't want to be hassled when we feel somebody's wanting something from us. With the US, they love it.
Yeah.
Right? They really see this as an entrepreneur trying to make a living for him and the family. And, the go-getters, and they will give them the time. And that's just one example where it's not just slightly different, it's a 180-degree difference. And as from the UK, you can often go over and expect that their culture is very, very similar to ours, and try and do it and sell in the same way as what you would in the UK. That's a completely wrong way to think about it. You've got to think of it as like you're going to a foreign land, say you're going to somewhere like Mars, with different humans. You've just got to think. You've got to think differently. You've got to think on your feet. But it's a fantastic country. I'd say it's more competitive. I think that forces the prices down lower, but there's a bigger ability to scale.
What advice would you give yourself expanding to America again? If you could kind of go back, what would be the one thing you'd tell yourself?
I would probably say go more often. So that one of the things I know I did differently to a lot of other firms is I was regularly visiting America, even when we weren't setting up a business there.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was immersion, culture, trying to figure out where the best place is to land and expand. And then once we kind of got on that, and we've got some very good people over there, I maybe stepped back more than what I would have.
Yeah.
If you commit, you've got to commit, and you've got to be going over there regularly and making sure that it has your touch, because humans are still, we're still very basic creatures, and we're still got a very evolutionary psychology type minds, and organizations do mimic the person at the top.
Yeah.
But that person has to be there for them to mimic it and it to form in a way that you want it. So I would probably, visit more often. I would adopt the US style of thinking, which I would say they look for help a lot more. They will reach out in a much easier way, if that makes sense.
And we'll come on to talk about the timelines of Recite Me. But I'm just curious, and the thing you mentioned earlier about being sort of president of the student union, how that was, because that presumably saw you in charge of almost kind of like a small business in its own right.
Yeah. Well, you can link that to the Americans, because the Americans' view is have a go. You might miss big, but you might win big, but just have a go. And when I was president of the student union, I got voted in, but I had no choice but to have a go, because it was out without a general manager for 7 to 8 months.
Right. That's
how long it's a very unique position to fill, so it takes you a long time to find the right person.
Yeah.
It was turning over nearly 3 million, and it was losing 27,000. Now, by the time I left, after 2 years, so I got re-elected, it was making £124,000 profit. And a lot of the turnaround was done by me and other quite very skilled students that were part of a fantastic team. So I had a go. Yeah. It worked. And I decided to keep on having a go.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'll ever stop having a go now at whatever it is with regards to business,
Did you recruit anyone that you worked with alongside in the union?
I didn't, no.
And what made you decide to run for the union in the first place? Because it's not something that's necessarily associated with business so much, and business people that go on to be.
It was it was an interesting time for that. It was Northumbria Students' Union, and it was at a time when every 2,000 capacity gig was done by the Students' Union. It was a city that didn't have a 2,000 capacity stadium.
Yeah.
So we done all the gigs. So we had a lot of external events.
Yeah.
So we had a crazy high beer barrelage.
Yeah.
And we were selling them at commercial prices. So we were buying it in, for students. And then we were selling it often at very high commercial, just normal prices that you'd find in the town.
Prices, yeah.
You wouldn't find in a students' union. I was dyslexic, and I really should have done something like marketing, I think, or something that I think I would have loved, but I had to try and stay away from English. I didn't realize I was dyslexic, but I knew as soon as English was involved and I had to do writing and reading or a lot of it, I was going to not perform well in the exams.
Yeah.
I was good at science. I was good at mathematics, and engineering seemed like a very good way to go. At the time when I left school, it was when the network, the mobile phone networks were really taking off. So you could make a lot of money, but the degree was boring. I mean, Jesus,
what was the degree in?
Electrical electronic engineering. I really enjoyed the people I worked with, and I made some fantastic friends. Friends today, I was Dave's best man at his wedding, and I met him at university. But the degree was boring, and you've got to remember, people are some courses are doing 7 hours a week, and they're going out partying.
Yeah,
and I'm like, well, I'm going to stop in and do my labs because I've done 37 hours worth of lectures. So to cut a long story short, I got bored.
Yeah,
and I got involved with the student union as a way of kind of enjoying it. And then I just got in and got very passionate. Your background's politics yourself. I felt like politics gives you an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, particularly in welfare for students. It's one of the highest sectors of suicide.
Yeah.
But the student union does fantastic work with regards to kind of trying to combat that. And I loved the ability to kind of do something that was meaningful in those 2 years. And have fun in one of the best nightclubs that you technically owned. So there was two sides.
Two sides.
There was a fun side, and there was a.
But there's always been a thread, I guess, of wanting to really help people through whatever it is you've been doing. So how long is it then till you start ReciteMe, and give us a potted history of that then?
So I come up with the idea. I knew from going through with the green paper and the white paper, and I can never remember which way it goes. Is it green paper first, white paper afterwards? That when you introduce legislation, you've got test cases, and then it gets tested in the courts, and that's when it starts having bite. So I knew there was going to be a long time for culture change, and nobody had invented the technology that I thought of, and I was very sure it was going to work. I just had to try and create a scenario where we could survive that long.
Yeah.
So we created the technology, but we also created a web development arm. So we've done a lot of work for people like the Direct Marketing Association and some quite big firms, just to try and keep the company alive long enough to see this culture change. And we started probably seeing after 5-6 years, people then starting to recognize the legislation.
Yeah.
And I've got to admit, the most frustrating thing I will probably ever experience in business is showing people the legislation, people recognizing that they need to do something, but also recognizing nobody else has done anything yet.
Yeah.
So they're not going to buy your technology because nobody else is, but come back to us when other people are buying it. Sort of, and you're trying to, you're living off cup of soups and tins of mackerel.
Yeah. And so when did you think, well, we've really got something here? When did you really first start to see that growth? Because it is quite a niche product that you're kind of building.
I can remember there was always this latent fear that it wasn't going to work, and had I sacrificed my 20s. And I think that's a theme, particularly on technology startups, is that you've almost got to look into the darkness sometimes and say this mightn't work, and I might have sacrificed some of the best years of my life. But I do remember the day where I kind of went, you know what, I think this is going to actually work. We were on our Christmas party, and our revenue was starting to uptick. We were still surviving on investment money, so we had a venture capital company that I had invested. And you never not... When you get into a position where you're worried about whether it's going to work or not, your default is you will always naturally worry.
Yeah.
And it takes something to switch it off. And it was just we had a Christmas party, and we were talking about, oh, this has been a great year. Look at last year, and we've got this client, and we're starting to bring on some blue chip clients. I just kind of had this realization. I think I might be okay.
Yeah.
I might even be able to buy a house at some point. It was just a strange, almost light bulb moment that this thing could actually work.
And so, how many of you are in the company at this stage then?
I'd say about 10.
Okay.
Between 10 and 15, I think, at that point.
And when you obviously had some experience of venture capital and taking the funding, when did sort of BGF come to the table, and when did they get involved?
My chairman had already had a company that BGF invested in, and he'd spoke about them, and immediately I'd said, when we were too small, that's the people I want involved. Because as a CEO, you've got to be concerned on running the business. Mm-hmm. And one thing BGF's renowned for is having very good investment agreements that don't tie CEOs with the worry that if this happens and that happens and that company is, you could technically be a bad leader and you could get booted out of the company. Now, that's common.
Yeah.
That is very, very common in the investment industry, but it doesn't serve the purpose, I think, because it leaves the founder distracted, because there's a latent kind of fear in the background. So as soon as I found out that how BGF operated, I said to him straight away, I says, they're the people we want to get invested. And this was probably 2 years before we ever had a meeting. So we were kind of moving in that direction of when are we big enough for us to approach them?
Yeah.
And then I believe they approached us, and it was just a very, very good match, and it has been. And it's probably one of the best things I've done with investment, because I feel like I can switch off from everything else and just concentrate on running the business.
And what else have they provided, if anything, other than capital?
A lot of it, I think, comes down to individuals. So our BGF contact, John Healy, has been fantastic. I find on a personality level, we get on brilliantly. And that's the number one thing. You've got to, I mean, from a BGF point of view, you've got to employ people who naturally will just be personable and get on well with people.
Yeah.
And, they do. I mean, John is fantastic, but he comes up with a lot of financial skills.
Yeah.
I think he was accountant. So he brings a lot, like typically the sheet that he uses to track our business is one of the main sheets that we use. So he feeds in the kind of the metrics that we use to track our company's performance. And I'm not just talking about figures with regards to financial figures. I'm talking about metrics with regards to measuring prospects and how far they are and how close they are to conversion.
Is finances something else that you struggle with being a dyslexic?
No, there is a form of dyscalculia.
Yeah.
And some people do struggle with numbers, but I tend to be pretty good. In fact, I think my dyslexia has actually been an advantage, because I can see patterns very easily in data.
Give us some of the case studies that you've worked with companies then, and how you've kind of like improved their sales, right? Because business at the end of the day is, often about the bottom line when it comes to it. Like, how have you been able to help businesses improve their bottom line?
Well, I think that one of the best ways to start is with kind of an overall research. And there's research that was commissioned by the National Car Rental. It was the UK arm, and it talked about displaced spending. Now, what displaced spending is if somebody has an accessibility need like myself and yourself, and goes to a website that's not accessible, what is the likelihood that they will then leave that website because it's not accessible and go to a website that is? And the chances of that are 83%. So 83% of people will leave the site that's not accessible and go to one that is. And that returns a displaced spending of 16 billion in the UK. So 16 billion pounds does not get spent on inaccessible websites because they are inaccessible.
Yeah.
That's the first point. But statistics, sometimes we can jump up to 7-8% of all people that come to the website will use Recite. One of the interesting stats that is that if they use Recite, the bounce rate is lower in general, and the time on the website is longer.
Okay.
So there's very interesting metrics that we seem to be able to hold people on people's websites for a lot longer, and the less likely to leave. And when you add that into websites that have millions of visitors, it's quite significant.
It really adds up.
Yeah.
I mean, this is called the Good Growth Podcast, right? And one of the things of growth is like, which metrics do you track and so on, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to kind of hear it from that kind of perspective. But what does, has there been a time where you've kind of been growing too quickly or not quickly enough? And how have you kind of dealt with that as an entrepreneur?
I've always had this suspicion that one of the things I've drilled into the members of staff, I think we hire incredibly well. Our retention rate is incredibly high. We never seem to have a need to get rid of people, and not many people leave. I often joke on, say, we're like Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out, sort of thing. Right? I often drill into people, the most dangerous thing you can do is grow, and grow fast. It's a dangerous thing, because danger is probably not the right word, but it's where you can take the eye off risk.
Yeah.
And the risk comes that there's fundamentals that make a business good, and growth is one of them, but it can also distract you from the other fundamentals.
Yeah.
EBITDA, invoice loss, burn rate.
Yeah.
All these are very important things. So when you're growing, you very much need to keep an eye on the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Of what, if you stopped growing, does this business have the ability to survive? Because it's a strange thing that a lot of businesses, they don't go under because they make enough profit. It's because they run out of cash.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of profitable businesses that go under because they just haven't got enough money left in the bank.
Yeah.
You know, and they didn't keep an eye on the fundamental, which is cash flow.
And what has there been a time where you just haven't been growing at all, and like how have you kind of like managed that?
I think we've hit kind of rocky periods, not too rocky, where growth has slowed.
Yeah,
we haven't stopped growing. Growth has slowed a little bit in the UK, but it's starting to pick up again. It had slowed in the US, and it's starting to pick up. But one of the things you've got to remember is that there's just market fundamentals as well. Is that we're in a very, very tricky period for the world economy.
Yeah.
In the last 2 years, and we've managed to grow in the UK the last 2 or 3 years, probably 40-50%.
Yeah.
The US higher, Australia higher, because the younger markets, and that's good considering, you know, the governments around the world putting interest rates and particularly trying to destroy money.
Yeah.
So, and gladly the interest rates are coming down now. So,
what was one of the first blue chip clients that you won?
I think Boots was one of the biggest that we won, but the one that stands out the most, I think, is Coca-Cola, because it was the UK dealing with the US, and it just kind of struck me that here we are in Gateshead, speaking to the biggest brand in the world, and they really get our technology.
Yeah.
And if you go back to what I said maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, it was a 6-year mission to get people just to understand they had to do something.
Yeah.
Now the biggest brand in the world knew what we did, and has bought our software and is planning on upgrading to some of our new software.
So that must have been quite a moment then.
Well, yeah. I mean, I drove past Lidl, and I went and bought a big pack of Coca-Cola. Push the phone out, you know. This is how I celebrate these days, you know. Drinking 2 cans of Coca-Cola,
Caffeine,
living life on the edge.
But presumably for some businesses, you know, it's like we were talking earlier around the metrics, but it can be making them hundreds of thousands of pounds, almost millions, right?
What metrics are you talking about in particular?
Well, finance profit, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, you've always got to, when you're growing very fast, you've got to take the decision of how much money you're going to burn with regards to how much growth you're going to achieve, and that in itself is a ratio, and you always need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
And even in that period where you're burning cash, it is still as possible for your EBITDA to be much more positive than the money that you're losing. So the good growth is keeping an eye of all of that fundamentals.
Yeah.
And having a very clear picture of when do you start scaling back growth, or sometimes you don't have to scale back growth, but often you get to a steadier growth curve for it then to start the profitability of the company to start massively rising.
Yeah.
You know, so there needs to be payback. That's the important thing. Sustainability.
Yeah. And what are your kind of reflections on building a business in the Northeast as well? Like, we hear it in your accent, you referenced it a couple of times. Like, what's it like building a business up there? I mean, I appreciate you haven't built one anywhere else necessarily, but so it's difficult. But just what are your kind of reflections on that?
Been fantastic. I think we were very lucky that Sage, which is the only, to my best knowledge, I think it's the only software company in the FTSE 100. It, you know, obviously when it floated, it created a lot of wealthy software entrepreneurs, millionaires, and they've then invested in software companies themselves or started software companies afterwards.
Yeah.
So we've got this kind of like legacy of, you know, I often joke on and say all roads leads to Sage. For example, my chairman was very high up in Sage. One of my investors was a company that Sage bought.
Yeah.
You know, so Northeast is an absolutely fantastic place to start a business. It's got a lot of embedded skills that you need. So you always need an ecosystem. That's the thing you need to be always wary of from a macro country level and a regional level as well. So if you're hiring somebody that has done SaaS software as a service sales in the past, you know, having a place that's had a lot of companies that's had somebody who leads a SaaS software company for sales around you is a very, very positive thing.
Yeah.
One of the comments actually is Barry from BGF, when he started expanding more into the Northeast from Leeds. I remember him saying, "I'm surprised how good it is up here, and we would have come up earlier had we known how good it was."
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good place.
And what's it like as a kind of like entrepreneurial ecosystem? Do people kind of get together? How does all that sort of like operate and so on? And is there kind of a bit of a BGF quartet there?
Yeah, I think we're very lucky. We're very lucky for two reasons, actually. Sage I've just mentioned, but we had this thing called the Jeremy Funds, and it was 100 million, I don't know if it was euros or pounds, that come from the European Investment Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And basically it was effectively lent to venture capital companies to invest in companies like ourselves. So my first round of venture capital was effectively money that was funneled from the Jeremy Funds.
Right.
And we paid back. They made 3 or 4 times the money they put into us.
Yeah.
So we kind of proved that ecosystem. That spurned on a very, very good Northeast tech scene that interacted, helped. It's a small enough city to be able to bump into people as well.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have to congregate around an area of a city. But the Northeast scene is fantastic for technology.
Yeah.
They're really good.
What advice would you give to a founder that's thinking of scaling up, taking some money from BGF, etc.? What do you say when people contact you?
Like the start of what I said, the best way to figure out that you can't do something is to try it.
Yeah.
But most people will decide in their head they can't do it and not try it. So my advice would be just to go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it. Take the American attitude that, you know, it's a badge of honor if you've tried and it hasn't worked out. But there's every chance that it will. And you can create jobs, you can change your own life, you can change life for people. You know, I've had people that's worked with me for 15 years now. It's a brilliant thing to go out and try it, and there's nothing wrong if it doesn't work. But the advantages that you have for the country, your region, yourself, your own family, the people that work for you, if you do make it, is massive. So just go out and try.
How have you changed as a leader since taking the BGF money? What have you had to develop in?
I think I've got more patience.
Right.
I think that's definitely. My leadership style has always been is always been less management, more leadership. And as long as you hire right, you aim to nurture people's skills. Now, you can't nurture people's skills in an area by telling them what to do.
Yeah.
So my leadership style has definitely been let them fail again, let them fail again. And it doesn't matter how long it takes, as long as they're on a path to being able to do something to a good standard, that's the right path to take. And it's one of the reasons why I think not many people leave, because the vast majority of people leave, it's not money, it's their line manager and the boss.
Yeah.
So we culture a lot of we don't do committees. We probably model our culture more of Apple, Tesla. They're renowned for just getting people that are skilled in a room, asking them to do something, monitoring them heavy, but giving them the freedom to do it how they choose.
Yeah.
But over this time, I've had to realize that nobody ever does it as quick as you want. Nobody ever does it in the way that you would like it. So you just need some patience and have faith in your staff, and it'll come through in the end.
Thank you, Ross, for coming on BGF's Good Growth podcast. What a great story.
Thanks for listening to the Good Growth podcast. If you enjoyed that, make sure to hit subscribe so you're the first to hear about new episodes. And always stay up to date on the latest growth insights.